2016 has been a year of the unexpected and the unprecedented, with events as far-ranging as Brexit and a Cubs World Series surprising analysts and intellectuals the world over. Powerful geopolitical forces like nationalism and globalism are locked in conflict over the mission of democratic societies, and the resulting disruptions have pitched people against each other in all forms of debate. Perhaps no event denotes the unexpected and the unprecedented nature of 2016 more than the election of Donald J. Trump. Luckily, we have two of the top political minds here with us this evening to help decode the 2016 election. Joel Benenson, founder and CEO of Benenson Strategy Group, has been named Pollster of the Year by the American Association of Political Consultants, among the most powerful people in DC by GQ magazine, and a part of the new lineup in Washington by Newsweek magazine. He was also included in the New Republic's The O List, which identified the 30 most influential players in Obama's 2008 run for office. Mr. Benenson and his firm won the Ogilvy Award for Government and Public Service. He is also the only pollster in American history to have served on 3 successful presidential campaigns. Most recently, he served as senior strategist for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. And many of us already know David Axelrod. He is a veteran of American politics and journalism and the former chief strategist and senior advisor to President Barack Obama. He currently serves as director of the Institute of Politics, senior political commentator for CNN, and host of the Axe Files, which today released its 100th episode. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Joel Benenson and Mr. David Axelrod.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You know, point of personal privilege here, or disclosure, or whatever. The first call I made when Barack Obama decided to run for president in 2008 was to Joel Benenson, with whom I'd worked and who I knew when we were both journalists, or when I was a journalist and he was just out of the journalism business working for Mario Cuomo in New York. And I reached out for Joel because he is not only brilliant and incisive, but passionate about his work. And nothing has changed in all this time. He is still that person. And you have the most unusual story. So I know we have a lot to cover tonight, but I just want you to give these folks a sense of how being an actor and a beer salesman led you to become a presidential pollster.
I just drank a lot in the beer store. We'd go to the back, we'd drink and say, hey, what about just becoming a pollster? And
this year, I think people would believe you.
Yeah, a lot of people would say, you know, when I used to say to people, you know, at parties and things, and there's a lot of noise, what do you do for a living? And I'd say, I'm a pollster. You know, people would go, an upholsterer? I guess they'd never met an upholsterer before. Yeah, it was a very nonlinear path, and for all of you students who are here and trying to figure out what you're going to do, feel free to share this story with your parents. But it did take me 10 years to get through college. I grew up in Queens, one of the outer boroughs of New York City, and I went to Queens College, which was part of the City University of New York, and it was free. And I was a theater major in college, and that happened kind of serendipitously, but I you know, got into it in high school and then stay within college, although I minored in political science. So I always thought I did,
Don't ask him to recite Shakespeare or we'll never get out of here.
That's right. Right, or Hobbes either. But I thought I minored in political science. It turns out I'm 2 credits short of actually officially having a minor. So the school won't give me an honorary degree in political science now. So, but you know, I was bouncing around in the 70s doing avant-garde theater. We had a small troupe of actors. We had one play that was performed off-Broadway at some well-known theaters in New York, the Cabiculo, La Mama, the Lincoln Center Street Theater Festival. And an uncle of mine said, you know, there's no money in what you're doing. I said, oh, I know that. And he was an accountant, and there are these beer distributorships in New York that are like warehouses where you can sell to the public retail, or you can sell wholesale to tavern owners or bodegas and grocery stores who have to buy beer and soda when they have cash because they can't get credit from the big Budweiser distributors. We would, you know, be able to buy from those folks. So I was doing that in a neighborhood called Crown Heights, which was extremely diverse, and it was a very...
And volatile.
And volatile, yeah, at various points, yes. There were a lot of But it was the most diverse, I believe, community in America at the time. This is in the late 70s and early 80s, and it was really a microcosm of what was about to happen in New York City. Legacy working class whites, because we were around the corner from Ebbets Field, but a very large Caribbean community. If anybody's from New York or you've ever seen the West Indian Parade down Eastern Parkway on Labor Day, my beer distributorship was in walking distance of that. So we used to sell a ton of Guinness Stout and Heineken because folks from Jamaica and the islands were drinking that. That was their native beer. And it was a fascinating education because, in fact, in 2012, Axe knows this story, somebody in my firm said, so of all the things you've done in your life, what do you think was the thing that most made you the good pollster that you've really become? And I said, being a beer distributor in Brooklyn. And everybody burst out laughing. We have this common area where we all eat. And she said, the wonderful woman, you know Shira. I said, no, seriously, being a beer distributor. And I said, look, I was a working class kid. I got to go to college because it was free, so I'm college educated, and that has been a great benefit to me, even though by that point I'd gotten my degree, obviously. But I said, for 7 years, everybody I was working with was living paycheck to paycheck. Everybody I was, employing, whether it was the, like I say, the guy who didn't graduate from high school from Bensonhurst, white guy who just wanted to get his kids a better future, the Panamanian cashier who worked for me, Emelita Jenkins, I still remember her name, who spoke with a thick Panamanian accent, and all she wanted was for her daughter to have all the opportunity in America. And up and down the line of people I dealt with, the tractor-trailer driver who was bringing us trailer loads of Budweiser or Schaefer or Miller beer from upstate New York and drove all night that we would unload either by forklift or by hand when the forklift broke down. These are all folks who were living paycheck to paycheck. And I think those voices were always in my head. And I think at some point I knew I didn't want to be a beer distributor, and I was reading a lot, and I finished college during those years actually. And it really rekindled my political interest that I had in college. And I grew up in the 60s. I was a bit of an activist, part of the anti-war movement, feminism through college. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And somebody said to me, make up a list. And I made up a list, and I decided I wanted to be a sports writer covering the New York Yankees. That was not an easy path. Turns out becoming a pollster was a little bit easier. But it did get me into journalism, and I started covering politics. And I covered politics, and then, as Axe said, we met on this '94 campaign. I left journalism after a pretty good career. I was the State House bureau chief of the New York Daily News, which was, the largest tabloid in America at one point. And I was covering Mario Cuomo, who was running for governor, and I think we talked a lot when he was having his dalliance with the presidency in '91, and he ultimately didn't run. But at that point, the reason I left journalism was I said to my wife at one point, I don't want to pretend that these two candidates are equals. I had a strong view about the guy who was going to run against Mario Cuomo, and I thought Mario was a giant. And he is one of my political idols. I thought he was brilliant, flawed in some ways. And that got me into politics, and Axe was doing the IE. That was actually, I'd been interviewing him a lot as a reporter because he was in consulting already. And that was the first race we actually worked together because you did the ads on the IE. Right. So it's a nonlinear path, but in my mind, everything I did along the way fits because as a pollster, I'm not just a numbers cruncher. I think about language, the impact of words, what do they really mean? We use qualitative and quantitative techniques, and I think that diverse background has helped me.
So that's a great sort of segue into the topic here. You went in and you worked as a kind of second in the 1996 Bill Clinton campaign. And then you did the two Obama campaigns with us. You've been polling for the White House these 8 years. You've been through presidential campaigns. As I've pointed out from time to time, neither of us are kids. And yet you chose to do this campaign. Did you have reluctance about doing the campaign?
Well, you know,
my point is you knew what campaigns entailed, how all enveloping, how physically and emotionally draining they are.
And I think, and you know this, after 2012, I didn't think I would do another one. And I think when the Democrats really got our clocks cleaned in 2014, I thought this election took on even greater importance. And I thought if I could play some role, as you say, we're not kids. I am older than David.
I was playing for that.
I may look younger. I may look younger, but I'm older.
I wasn't playing for that.
I thought if I could play a role, I should. And, I think it's hard. I think, in candor, these things have gotten so long now. I first met with Hillary Clinton, I think in December of 2014, and then early January.
And they kind of reached out to you.
They reached out to me. I knew Huma for a long time, and there were folks she was talking to, some of whom were from Obama world. And when I first met with her, we didn't know each other. And she said, everybody I talk to says that I have to talk to you if I'm going to do this. So, we had a very good conversation. The first meeting I thought was scheduled for about 45 minutes, and I think we went for about an hour and a half. And I
Probably because she asked you about your life story.
that took up 80 of the 90 minutes, and then we talked about the campaign for 10 minutes. And I think it was just a good conversation. I was very honest with her. I knew obviously a lot about her. We'd run against her in 2008. And I think she appreciated my candor there. And, I think when it got time to have a serious discussion, we did. And I thought this was important. And if I can make a difference, I should.
Hindsight is perfect. Hillary Clinton was in many ways, as you look back, sort of the quintessential sort of establishment candidate in what was shaping up to be an anti-establishment year. Did you have those concerns at the time?
Well, look, there are a couple of things that I said to her from the outset. I said, first of all, you're trying to do something that has been done very rarely in our history, which is succeed a two-term president of your own party. I think the last Democrat that did that was probably in the 19th century, actually, forgetting Roosevelt's 4 terms. And I think even on the Republican side, George H.W. Bush did it in '88.
Right, and that's the last time.
What's that?
And then, that was the last time.
The last time. But even then, it's been very rare.
Since the 20s.
Yeah, and it's been very rare. And I was very candid with her about that undertaking. The other thing I said to her is, we're a pretty young country. We're 240 years old, but compared to our counterparts in Europe, we're a young country. And the fact is that in our history, I think Donald Trump is now only the 7th person elected president who was over the age of 60 on their first election day. 45 presidents, only 7 out of 45, 60 or older on their first election day. And I said those things to her because I think, you have to go into these things. I certainly do as a strategist, as a pollster, thinking about them. And I think it's important that the candidate evaluate them too. It was no doubt succeeding an incumbent, and President Obama's numbers at that point were not as strong as they are now. And I think, but they were strong, for someone going into the last 2 years of a second term relative to where some of his predecessors had been. And I think we had to find a lane where we could be different from him in some way.
But she, of course, was not just any candidate.
Not
she
at
was
all.
the Clinton franchise, the Clinton, the Clinton history was long,
Right.
and very much connected with American politics for a generation, really.
And the challenge was going to be to take the approach, as I said at the outset, you are the most famous, least known person there is. People know a lot less about her. She's a fairly private person. I think she always has been, notwithstanding a lot of public exposure.
How debilitating do you think that was? I've always believed that authenticity, and I've said this to you, is a leading indicator in presidential races, and it's hard to be authentic when you're very guarded. That may be authentically who she is very guarded. But
yeah, but I think a lot of people who have succeeded are private and try to create some separation between their public lives and private lives. And I think particularly somebody who, raised a daughter in the White House and under the spotlight of that. And I think you go through those things. And I think, I'm not going to second guess anybody who has to live that because it's unimaginable.
Do you think she's endured unusually harsh scrutiny?
Oh, I think For 30 years, absolutely. I think if you look at, I mean, look, there's going to be a lot of coverage and a lot of discussion going on still this week, and there has been. And I was at some discussions last week or the week before, both one in Europe at NYU school over there with Democrats and Republicans, and one in California. I think there's a massive discussion going on among, including people in the media, about how this was covered. Was it balanced? You know, that this goes beyond just the fake news issue that kind of the new media are dealing with. But I think there's a lot of introspection going on, and there should be, about how this was covered. You know, at the end of the day, you know, it's like I would say on television interviews at some point at the end, you know, I get asked every time I was on television about the fact that, well, how is Hillary Clinton going to win if people don't trust her? Donald Trump was less trusted and honest in the eyes of voters throughout the campaign than Hillary Clinton was. How many of you ever saw a Trump surrogate on TV? Show of hands. Ask, how is Donald Trump going to win if the majority of American people don't trust him and think he's honest? Anybody ever see one of his surrogates ask that question? No. Anybody see a Clinton surrogate ask that question? Yeah. So I think there's no question that there's an imbalance. And
so do you think that? Well, let me just move along here, because I'm going to get back to this question. Every successful campaign has a story that is discernible and resonant, that is rooted in who that candidate is. Did Hillary have such a story?
Yeah, I think she did, and I think, you know, if you go back to our convention, which some pundits, including those I've heard on CNN, called it the best convention ever put on in history.
Yeah.
And if you look at the narrative arc of that convention, it was some of it was about Trump, in the case we're making about Trump, but much of it was about Hillary Clinton's life. And you know, we talked about the you know what I said, the least known famous person. You know, we had one night, the second night of our convention, that we dubbed internally the fights of her life. A woman who for 30 years has actually been fighting to make a difference in people's lives. Families and children very much at the center of it, but including disabled people doing things in the you know, in the White House as First Lady. You know, a lot of people know she did CHIP and had something to do with health care and tried to get health care. But you know, she reached out to Republicans in those days. She worked with Tom DeLay, who was the whip for the Republicans on the floor during impeachment of President Clinton in the 90s, and found out that he cared about foster kids. And she went to work with him and said, look, we don't agree on anything, but we care about these kids. Can we help get more of these kids adopted? Right. So there was a story to tell that we felt. But it's
interesting how you, I mean,
they were very powerful.
I did think it was a very good convention. I think the numbers bore that out afterwards, and Donald Trump reacted badly for 3 weeks to the convention, which underscored that. But as you tell those stories, you tell them about what you talk about, what she did for this group and that group and this group. And the critique, and again, hindsight is 20/20, is that these appeal to segments, but there wasn't an overarching message that spoke to the entire country, so that people couldn't see themselves in what she was talking about, particularly on the economy.
I disagree with that. I think we were making a forceful case around a set of issues we described as family economics, and that families were different and are different than they were 20 or 30 years ago. And people, you know, as good as President Obama's numbers are now, you know, they are not still feeling like they've gotten where they want to be in their lives. And there are a host of things that have been holding them back, and they are issues around minimum wage for, you know, millions of people who are working in poverty.
She had more policy than anybody who ever ran for president.
But they were constructed around family economics. They were constructed about helping families get ahead and stay ahead. People have been inching along in these 8 years. We know we're having all this good job growth, but they wanted permanence, and they know the gains they've made. They certainly don't feel the gains they've made are durable yet.
Absolutely, but do you think that people perceived her as that champion on election day?
I do. I think they perceived her as that champion on election day. Look, I think there are multiple forces at work here, and I think that, you know, we also, which I'm sure we will get to, but, you know, we were winning this campaign. Like, we were winning this campaign. We came out of the third debate consolidating our lead. We have a variable in this race that we really didn't have to any great extent in either of President Obama's races with third-party candidates who were polling at a sizable number for a presidential campaign. Significantly higher than Ralph Nader, who everybody remembers as a third-party candidate, who got like 1.6% of the vote in Florida. We had third-party candidates polling at 8 to 11%, 12% early in October. And we always had these two groups of people, Trump defectors and Hillary defectors, people who in the two-way would vote for one of them, but when we asked the four-way question in the poll would move to the third-party candidates. And we saw after the third debate, we were consolidating, we had momentum, and we get to 11 days out when the FBI director takes an unprecedented action and throws a monkey wrench into the campaign that you couldn't have anticipated.
But let me
and
ask,
and you could see palpably that stalled our
email
momentum.
Case, when you signed up with Hillary Clinton, you didn't know about this private email account, correct?
Yeah, correct.
So when the story broke, you probably learned about it in proximate, vicinity to the rest of us, and then you saw that her poll numbers took a deep hit after that. How damaging along the way was this email story? Because you're citing the Comey thing as a decisive blow at the end.
Well, but here's the point, and I've said this all through the campaign. People made up their minds about emails long before the Comey event.
Then why was the Comey thing damaging?
Because it put it into the discussion. You're running a campaign where your closing argument is out there, and you now have the FBI who injects something back into the campaign, unprecedented. You have Trump surrogates going out there and using it to gin up their base, right, and get some of their folks
and you guys had to finish
again.
differently than you would have had that not happened. Is that true? I mean, you were pretty much on the attack after that.
Well, I don't know how much we finished differently. I think you want to close strong. I think, look, I said 5 days before the Comey announcement, I was on George Stephanopoulos' show Sunday morning, and at the end he said, "So what keeps you up at night?" And I said,
You said Comey.
Well, it goes back to working for Mario Cuomo and rules he said about unexpected things in campaigns. And I said to George, what keeps me up at night is the unexpected, the thing that you can't anticipate, that you can't know right now, that can change a dynamic with very little time. And I think that what that did is, I think it stalled the momentum of our defectors coming back to us in enough numbers, and I think it helped animate his defectors more, and I think that was part of, that's why I say it was a monkey wrench.
Had there not been emails, there would
But
not
David,
have been a
here's
Comey
the reality.
story.
That story first comes out in March of 2015, and on October 19th, 20th, and 21st, and after the third debate, we are winning this campaign.
Let me ask you a
People
question.
had made up their mind about emails.
I hear you on that. Let me just, on one more thing on emails though. Where was her, on the day that the email story broke, where was her favorable rating among voters?
Oh, I don't remember.
But it was above water. She was more positive than negative.
Yeah, it was above water.
And it sunk below at that point.
No, not right away. It took a bit of time, and it was hammered away at by Republicans and the Republicans in Congress. And, you also forget that, as I say, people made up their mind. People go to their partisan corners a lot on these issues. So, this really was about what Comey did at the end in a way that was unprecedented. He was condemned by Republicans and Democrats for taking an action that was against all the rules and principles in the FBI. And you could see the effect on momentum at that point.
One other factor in this campaign obviously was the hacking and WikiLeaks. You yourself you made a few stories on this WikiLeaks thing because you were giving candid advice that you thought was private advice, as everyone in campaigns do. I've always said no campaign could have endured being hacked in that way because you don't have private strategic discussions with a mind toward it being made public. How much impact did all that have?
Well, I'll tell you, the challenge is that, and we said repeatedly we weren't going to authenticate any of those emails. And the reason for that is because every one of them are subject to manipulation by the hackers. They can change order of things. They can move things around. They have them. We don't know what they have at that point, right? We're not going through them. Look, I think
It's also a good place to rest if you don't want to comment on those things, right?
I think I commented on some during the course of it, but look, I think the problem is the challenge with that was simply that it just put the email, voters were just conflating. It was just more email stuff. And so during that period, it was just simply, as I said, people who had made up their minds about it had made up their minds long before it. And it was an annoyance because, think about how much attention those emails got because, it was so titillating to the press instead of covering what was actually going on in a meaningful way about people's lives in the campaign, frankly, which they abandoned to write about the next John Podesta email or whatever, or mine.
You were quoted in one of those. This goes back to the question I asked earlier.
You sure it wasn't one I sent to you, right?
I would never quote those. You emailed to the group, the strategic group. Do we have any sense from her what she believes in or what she wants her core message to be? What did you mean by that?
So only because I addressed this inadvertently on TV once before will I address it again. This is a perfect example of why you don't authenticate things that could be manipulated. That was in relation to a very specific speech, and if I go back to 2008 or 9 or 12 with you, or with Grisolano, who's sitting in the front row, my other brother in wars here, we would have had that discussion about a specific speech. What does the president want to say? What did Senator Obama want to say in that speech? And that we were talking about a very specific speech there.
Let me ask you about one other thing, and it leads into the discussion about Bernie Sanders, who obviously also didn't take to heart the talk about how running for president is for people under 60. But do you, how much damage did his campaign do to Hillary, and specifically the issue of her speeches to Wall Street, which he hammered relentlessly?
So can I talk more broadly about this? And I'm going to quote something you said to me about when you put the Obama...
No, you can't quote me.
No.
That's not fair.
I think it is fair.
Okay.
I think in this case you won't mind it,
All
right?
Okay.
I asked you at the start of the Hillary Clinton campaign, when you put the team together for then Senator Obama, I knew Axe always had this great thing the day after Election Day in 2008. He had all the guys and women he'd brought together to put this team together. And we had this brunch, and he said, when Barack Obama called me and said, go do this, he said he felt like Danny Ocean in Ocean's 11, and he could go put the best team together with the best people he knew and trusted. And I called Axe when I started the Hillary campaign, and I said, so when you put the team together, aside from all of that, was there anything else you were looking at? And he said, yeah, he wanted people with an insurgent mentality because we were going to be an insurgent campaign. You don't mind me quoting that, right? And
Not so far.
I think, and I'll tell you something, and I think when you look at the history of presidential campaigns and you go back, people who have been the insurgent, maybe this goes to us being a young country and are, really a country that took on the most powerful force on earth, and 240 years ago, the King of England, who was, an empire. I think there's some appetite for an insurgent over and over again, and I think it's the outsider. I think it's something that people may be gravitating towards in a way that I wasn't, fully thinking about at the beginning. And I think for Sanders, for Senator Sanders, he tapped that in a way with a very powerful diagnosis about what was still, after 8 years of President Obama, frankly, causing people distress, a rigged economic and political system, which he diagnosed very perfectly and succinctly for people. Now, ultimately, we won in the primaries, I think, because people weren't enthralled with his solutions as much, but there was power in that
diagnosis. Also because you had
diagnosis.
tactical advantages, in fairness, right? A very powerful base within the African-American community, particularly among older African-American voters in the South. That was very beneficial to her. It was a pitched battle, or a pitchforked battle.
Look, it was very close. We went through every primary, not unlike 2008. But he was a strong challenger, and he was the insurgent.
Did you expect that? The guy was a 74-year-old Jewish socialist from Vermont, which is not the sort of portrait of the successful presidential candidate. But of course, that has all gone out the window anyway.
Yeah, well, I was once a Jewish socialist from Queens.
And nobody's voting for you, brother.
Nobody's voting for me either, yeah. So, I mean, look, I think that, before, you have to remember the conversation going back that far. There was a lot of discussion about would Elizabeth Warren run or not. There's definitely some appetite for someone who was going to still take on Wall Street, take on the excesses, take on corporate greed. And so, I think.
So in this context, the speeches weren't helpful. They weren't helpful, Joe.
David.
Don't make me do a show of hands.
One of the things that WikiLeaks came out with is some of the speeches. Look, I think that, you've heard me say this. I think you've said this too, that presidential elections are about big things, not small things. Doesn't mean small things don't or can't matter. But ultimately,
but small things can seem big.
They can.
In that they give you a window.
But we won a Democratic primary not just because of tactical advantages. We won a Democratic primary because Hillary Clinton represented the promise of certain things that would make a real difference in people's lives. People were, and keep in mind in New York, Bernie Sanders came to New York and did an interview at the New York Daily News, which really raised the curtain on his own inability to explain how he would do anything he was promising to people. And one thing people in America don't want, or didn't want, at least in the Democratic primary certainly didn't want, was something that wasn't real to them. They are hungering for some real stability, real security, and there was a challenge in being the less insurgent or the establishment candidate for someone who had been in a Washington figure for 30 years. But there was also something that was valuable and desirable. And look, the rules of the game are the rules of the game. We're winning the popular vote by a couple of million here at the end of the day, a bigger margin than most folks who've been in this position that we're sitting in right now, because frankly, her message did resonate with more people.
When did you start becoming deeply concerned about Donald Trump?
Well,
presumably not at 8:30 on that November 8th.
At some point in the spring, and I think it's before he wraps up the nomination. I think that, and this goes back to the unexpected. He is nothing if not unpredictable. Obviously,
yes.
He's unconventional.
That's fair to say.
Yeah, unconventional, probably to a fault for a president of the United States,
or even for a president-elect.
But I think you realize that there is going to be a whole different set of challenges that you're going to have to deal with here that are not like anything you've experienced before. But you could also go to school on things that happened in the Republican primaries. I think in the debates, for example, we were able to, I think we won the 3 debates, I think because the team we had. And the analysis of Trump in debates really helped us deal with him in that setting. But day in and day out, the thing you can't control about him is how he was able to dominate, use, and manipulate the media. And I'm not using the word manipulate in an insidious way, but if you don't care whether anything you say is true or not, and you're not being judged harshly for it, well, then just keep saying stuff that's not true. She's got pneumonia, she's got Parkinson's, whatever it was, all of which was BS, but they're unabashed
the pneumonia
about
thing
it.
wasn't BS.
Well, no, the pneumonia thing wasn't, but Parkinson's, she doesn't have the stamina,
Right.
Pneumonia, she went to the 9/11 thing because she wanted to.
Yeah, we don't have to go there. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
But I think if you are unabashed about saying things that are simply not true,
that you believe are true at the moment you say them.
I don't think for a minute he believes they're true. I do not. I certainly, maybe he does. That would be even more frightening sometimes. I'll leave that to psychologists, but I think, there is a pattern there, and the fact checkers have documented it.
Yeah, the fact checkers are probably the most morose people in America today.
Well, look, this will be, a discussion folks are going to have. And
we're going to be talking about this next quarter here.
Look, and I think, and I've said this at some of the panels and where there were some journalists and some discussions about this. I said, you can't just consign your fact checking to page 26 of the A section and think you've done your job. At some point when there is a pattern of behavior that relates to dissembling, let's use whatever euphemism you want.
Lying.
Or lying, right? At what point does that become an essential part of the story about that
The question
candidate?
is, you know, what is disturbing and a point for study is how much that mattered. I mean, you look at the exit polls and, you know, a large number of voters said that they didn't think that Donald Trump was temperamentally suited to be president, and including about 20% of his voters. A large number said they didn't think he was qualified to be president, including about 20%
of his voters.
Voters. So, you know, this is a new paradigm that is we got to get our arms around. But nonetheless, he won, and so I would be remiss having one of America's most esteemed pollsters here if I didn't ask you, what the hell happened with the polls?
Well, so, you know, it's interesting because if you look at the last week or so of the election, you know, I could, you know, pull out 6 polls that were between 2 and 5 points, basically, right?
National polls.
National polls,
right,
between 2 and 5 points.
And that's where it'll end up.
And it's going to end up probably at about 2.
But it's the state polls that were
well,
misleading.
look, state polls, and you know the challenge with state polls. I mean, in terms of the public polling. Now, look, we have an epidemic of polling in this country on the public side.
It's killing me.
They are cheap headlines. Well, it's not killing me yet. It is my business, right? Although, you know, this time you know, hanging up the spikes, right? You're going to hold me to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Look, I think the challenge with state polls is that you now have almost every university realizes that, hey, if we put out a poll and slap our name on it, we'll get the name of our university out there. Doesn't matter if you know anything about Wisconsin or North Carolina or Florida, you can do it. And more are doing it. And what's happening is the probability forecasters, which is another discussion, you know,
Nate Silver,
they get covered, and they
others.
get covered as tracking polls. I mean, I remember going on the network you're on, CNN, and saying, you know, you guys would do fine if you would only report on CNN's polls and not report the next day on Suffolk University's poll as if it's a tracking poll. Like, you can't treat them all as equal, and I'm not picking on Suffolk or anybody else. I'm using it as an illustration here. But, you know, you can't treat these things all as
Tomorrow's
perfect
headline,
science.
Suffolk University blasts
The
Benenson.
media, you know, I've said to people in the media, you know, people who I worked with, people who I've known for years, as you know, a lot of journalists, you know, you are some of the most inquisitive, dogged people at ferreting out the truth. But when you get a press release with the word poll in it,
Yeah.
it's like you go stupid.
This is true.
And you report it without asking a
Well,
single
that's a lazy
question.
way to cover the elections, and
Yeah.
that's what's
Yeah.
happened. But be that as it may, in
So here's why state
Pennsylvania,
polls.
in
Here's why,
Michigan
yeah.
and Wisconsin, if you took all the polls that were taken for months in advance, the vast majority of them would have had Hillary Clinton
So
winning.
first of all-
and let me just finish. There isn't anybody I spoke to on either side
thought Trump was winning.
who thought Trump would win Pennsylvania, Michigan, or
Right.
Wisconsin. I think most people conceded that Ohio was going to be tough.
Right.
Iowa
Yes.
would be tough.
Yeah. There are a couple of things, like when you talk about going back for months, Mark Penn, who I worked with in 1996 on the Clinton campaign, had been Hillary's pollster in 2008, he had a phrase when I started working for him, and he said, data is disposable. You know, one of the problems now, all these averages do go back months and months, so I always look at the more recent averages. But the challenge, I think, for a lot of these pollsters at the state level is that it is harder to create a model of the electorate in each state. You know, we try to have multiple streams of data in a campaign. You know, we saw some tightening in some of these states as it was getting closer. There's no doubt about that. You know, as I said, particularly post-Comey. But you try to have multiple streams of data, so you're always checking on it. But, you know, we had a big battleground universe. We never had you know, in the last 2 weeks, last 11 days, never had a very big lead. You know, we were looking at, you know, pretty much around a 3 to 4 point race at best. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if people would ask me where I thought it would finish, I was saying, you know, anywhere from 2 to 5. So
I haven't really studied this, but where among the battleground states that you were polling, what was the end result?
I think in the 10 states we were polling, we probably ended up being -2, probably because of Florida and North Carolina and Pennsylvania, 3 big states that, we knew North Carolina would be neck and neck. He ended up winning it by about 3 or 4 points. I think it was always, we were +1, we were -1, that kind of thing. Florida, we had felt also was a low single-digit race. We felt obviously best about Pennsylvania.
There seem to be 3 things that I saw in common in the exit polling. One is that she was a little bit off among minority voters, a few points off among African Americans, more than a few among Hispanic voters, 7, I think, off of where Obama was, and Asian voters, maybe 10, and then among millennials, and then obviously this problem among non-college educated white voters. What happened?
Well, again, I think, you're going to think I'm a broken record going back to Comey, but there's some overlaps with those groups. And so when you look at the percentage of people under 40 or under 45 who voted for third-party candidates at the end, it was between 6 and 7%. When you look at the people over 45 who voted for third-party candidates, it was 2%. There was an overlap there in minorities and millennials, I believe. I mean, we don't have crosstabs from the exit polls yet, where those were our third-party defectors who didn't come home, who stalled at the end. And I think, that's 6 points. I will tell you that David knows I don't do a lot of political races myself anymore, but the last one I did that I lost was a governor's race in New Jersey. And there was a third-party candidate, and it's the only time in my career that on election day, when the candidate said, so are we going to win or lose? I said, it was Governor John Corzine then. I said, I just can't tell you, John. I said, I don't know. If the third-party guy gets 10% or more, you're going to lose. If he's under 10, we'll win by a point or 2. And of course, we lost, or the other way around.
I know I want to take some questions. I'm going to ask you this last question.
Sure.
How surprised were you when the numbers started coming in on election night? And what was the scene like around you as these numbers came in?
You get very nondescript reports during the day. You get
We're setting up a microphone. Is that where it's going to be?
Great.
So if you have a question, why don't you make your way over to that wall, and Joel will talk long enough for you to get there.
Right. I'll filibuster. Take your time. Look, I think you have to wait for returns to start coming in. So that starts happening around 8 o'clock. And even if there are exit polls floating around, you can't ever bank on them because they're incomplete. The networks get them, the networks buy them. You may get bits and pieces here and there, but you can't count on them. I think at some point, probably about 10 o'clock, it's becoming clear that some of the states were underperforming. We knew early in the day we had voting problems in North Carolina. You're weighing decisions during the day, as you know, do you go to court or not and slow things down? People who had been voting in the Durham area had never had their voting machines break down, and they broke down. They had to vote on paper all day long in Durham, North Carolina. In fact, for a period, they stopped voting for about an hour and a half. So, you had things like that were worrisome. But we heard high reports of turnout in some core places, so you think things are on track.
Which
and then you
didn't
start
necessarily
getting
turn out to be true.
That there was high turnout.
One of the problems was low turnout in places like Milwaukee,
well,
Detroit.
Look, I think, all the groups, the demographic groups aside that you mentioned, is I think that when you look at the numbers, I think probably where, some of this is happening is in exurban counties, not just suburban counties and rural counties, et cetera. I think we're going to have to take a little more time to really dissect the numbers.
One of the things that kind of surprised me on election day was I'm looking at the numbers, and I'm looking at a thing like Macomb County, kind of quintessential blue-collar Reagan Democrat county that people have been studying for 30 years. And Obama carried it by 4%, and she lost it by 12.
Well, look, there are some anomalies as I'm watching the returns that I'm thinking don't make sense to me. So I'm looking at numbers at some point in the night when we're now behind in Wisconsin and behind in, Michigan, and I'm saying, how is it that we're only down 9 points in Texas, 6 points in Georgia, and we're losing Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. It didn't make sense to me. There's some anomaly there, and those are the kinds of things I struggle with. But you've got a long line here.
But I will. I think one part of the answer to that, because I looked at that question, is that the percentage of non-college educated whites was actually considerably smaller in Texas because of the large number of minority voters in that state. But anyway.
Hi, my name is Matt Enlow. I'm a second-year student at the law school. People that I know that spoke with Hillary Clinton during the campaign privately said that she was really impressive, had really nuanced policy positions, was very warm. But in public, we saw very little of that. She did very few press conferences. She didn't do so many community meetings or anything like that. If you had the opportunity to do it all over again, and if she did too, do you think that she would go for a more candid sort of approach?
So, a couple of things. First of all, I think she did more press conferences in the last 100 days of the campaign than Donald Trump did. I don't think he did any, by the way. And I think press conferences, it's
Not a place to be charming.
It's also not a useful, people think it's a big deal. It's actually, for reporters care about it. It is not an effective way for voters to really get a lot of information. It's chaotic. They can't hear the questions half the time. I mean, I think you do a lot of interviews on TV. Look, I think, as I said before, we ran the campaign we ran. We're not going to do a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking about, looking backwards. We think we know what happened at the end of the race that stalled some momentum we had coming out of the third debate. And I think, look, in any campaign, you play to your strengths. In terms of, policy positions and things like that, what gets covered. You don't control what's get covered. And I said that's, my comment about Donald Trump's strength was how he could and did drive, for better or worse, for truthhood or falsehood, could drive coverage with tweet storms. And, that was like catnip to the press. And, we
also
did some of that.
hour-long sort of open mic night rallies where he sort of...
Look, but here's, you asked about the coverage. And I'm sorry, because this is off the topic of your question. It goes back to one of yours.
I was interested in the community meetings and just getting her to be more candid in general. The press conferences was just one outlet for
she seemed a little scripted, is what the young man is saying.
Well, look, she did a lot of town halls more during the primaries than the general. I don't know. If you watch Donald Trump at the end, he was reading off his teleprompter, and he's not a skilled reader off his teleprompter. Right. So let's not talk about being scripted.
He actually surged then when he wasn't speaking his mind.
Now I lost my train of thought about what I
wanted. We'll go on to the next
one.
Let me just say, I'm taking student questions first. So once all the students have asked questions, we have time left, then others can ask questions.
Hi, I'm Andy. I'm a first year at the college. My question for you is, having seen how Donald Trump drives coverage with his tweets, a couple of weeks ago we had his Trump University case settled, and then the next day the story was Trump wants a safe space from the cast of Hamilton. Just a few days ago, the story was Donald Trump has conflicts of interest, and today we're talking about whether millions of people voted illegally. How, over the next 4 years, is the media going to avoid having that, the herd instinct of wanting to get to that story before someone else does, and focus on a story when there's substance, and stick with it for a week or a month or however long it takes, in the way that they did with Hurriyun Khan, with Alicia Machado, and with things like Trump University at the earlier stages of the campaign?
Go ahead.
I'm not sure what the heart of the question is. If it's about what will it take for the media to stay with a story that's important?
Yep.
I think probably of all the things you've mentioned, I think the conflict of interest story is one that should have been covered much more diligently during the course of the campaign. I think his business enterprises were somewhat known. We've also learned you left out the fact about self-dealing from his foundation. I don't know if you saw that story. Has to pay fines to the IRS because the forms were finally posted. I think that's one that I think has implications for our national security, for our economic well-being, and I think it's incumbent on the media to not let go of that story. It is nonsense that a president can't have conflicts of interest. They can. and the media needs to be dogged about it.
I would just say this, though. I agree with all of that, and I think it's more important than ever for the media to be vigilant. But Donald Trump's going to be president of the United States on January 20th, and he's going to start making decisions that are going to impact on policy in a way that affect people's lives. And in a sense, I think he would welcome the sideshow of all of this. But what matters to people, I think, is how things affect their lives. What kind of decisions are being made in Washington? Now, some of it may have to do with conflicts of interest, but it seems to me the media also needs to focus on what the job of covering government is and making sure that people understand what the implications of the decisions that are being made are on the country and on their lives. Next question, please.
Can I go back to the point I forgot about, because it relates to media coverage quickly?
Do you want me to get that kid to stand back up?
No, let the next guy go to the microphone.
Okay.
You know, a good example of Trump and how the media covered him as opposed to Hillary, and the question before about, she's good in this setting and that setting. The day that Donald Trump was going to supposedly apologize for the birtho lie that he spread for 8 years or 5 years, if you watch the network coverage that day, they put a bunch of veterans behind him on the stage. He had 12 different people introduce him for about 90 seconds to 2 minutes each, and the cable networks covered every one of them, giving their testimonials to what a wonderful guy he was. He got up on stage. He totally, just conned the media, and they covered 15 minutes of testimonials to him, and then he gets up and he says, Barack Obama was born in the United States, and he walked off stage.
Yeah. I think one of the things that has to be grappled with is that you have a news media that is both a business and a trust. Yes. And these things sometimes come into conflict, and they came into conflict in a big way in this campaign, and it should be the source of a lot of soul searching about what the appropriate role is and how do you strike that middle ground. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ian. I'm a first year at the college. So there's been a lot of talk about how a vote for Trump was a vote against the establishment, but I've seen a lot of really compelling arguments that based on the results of a lot of the congressional elections and based on President Obama's approval ratings, that perhaps that's not entirely the case. Do you think a vote for Donald Trump was primarily about the fact that he was sort of an anti-establishment candidate, or do you think his base kind of came from something else?
No, I think it's a combination of things. I mean, I think that he had, he was the anti-establishment candidate. I think people are frustrated with Washington. It's a legitimate pain point for people to have. Washington, we've had the most obstructionist Congress we've had probably in modern times. You go back to George Bush. Democrats voted in Congress with President Bush on several signature achievements. I think we know during the Obama years we saw almost none of that. And so I think there is a sense of, well, he may be a bomb thrower, he may not be perfect, but somebody's got to shake up that place. And so I think part of that was, his persona probably was demonstrably a continuation of what they would like to do to Washington, is just shake the place up.
Just to underscore this point, in the exit polls, national exit polls, which candidate quality mattered the most, Donald Trump, he won among only one of the 4 categories they offered, which was can bring change, but he won 83% of those voters who said they wanted to bring change, and that was the largest single cohort of the 4 options that were offered. So he dominated in the primary and he dominated in the general that vote among people who were fed up with Washington and wanted change, and I'm sure among those people were folks who said he didn't have the temperament or the experience.
And I think it's about Washington, because if you look at President Obama's favorable ratings now in the polls that are out there, they are probably as high as they've been since 6 months after his inaugural. Even higher than when he got reelected by a significant margin.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Taylor. I'm a first year at the college. So much of the post-election critique of the Clinton campaign is centered on a perceived lack of outreach to working class populations that you touched upon a bit earlier, especially in Rust Belt states, swing states, that ultimately cost her many votes on election day. So I was wondering if you thought that outreach was there, was it enough, and do you think the message was strong enough to reach these populations, and if not, what should have been done differently?
I mean, look, I think it takes a long time I don't get over losing easily, but it also takes a long time to digest all the data. And even the exit polls, David and I know they're not fully weighted yet. They takes a little bit of time, and you got to look at some of the crosstabs. You know, I'm not going to second guess our campaign. I think we actually ran a damn good campaign, and I think we were in a position to win it, and we're winning it. And you know, I think obviously I don't like the result. There's nothing good about not executing it the way, you know, and getting the outcome that you want. But you know, I think I'm going to do more digging, not less digging, because it's the nature of my personality to fully understand it. But I think, again, there are some multiple big things that were at play. And I do think an unanticipated event here, like with less than 2 weeks to go, and with 2 third-party candidates out there that had, you know, normally third-party candidates fade a lot earlier. You know, I thought after the conventions they'd fade. They just never faded. And to me, that was also always a worrisome factor because you couldn't, that was a dynamic you couldn't control as much.
You know, the worst thing in the world is to lose a campaign, and I lost a lot of them. And everybody's a genius in the aftermath. You know, I always say you're never as smart as you look when you win, and you're never as dumb as you look when you lose.
You saying I look dumb?
No,
I think
this
so.
was a big wind-up to say I'm sitting next to one of the smartest people that I've ever met, and so I don't say this by way of criticism of you so much as of the body politic generally and of the Democratic Party in particular. There's something huge going on, and the fact that it's happening in not just our country but every advanced economy where liberal democracies are on the run and right-wing populist candidates are doing better. There's something bigger going on, and it has to do with revolutionary changes in our economy. The fact and trade, I think, is less of an issue than the fact that we every single day take steps forward in technology, find ways to eliminate more jobs that were done for good wages. You know, auto factories take 1/10 of the number of people to man them today, or woman them today, as they did 30 years ago. And this is going to continue at a faster and faster pace. And we haven't told a real story about that, and we haven't offered compelling answers to it, and we need a national strategy to do it. Hillary Clinton had a lot of really interesting proposals, but in my view, they were a lot of trees, but the forest wasn't clearly described, and the challenge wasn't clearly described. And until we address that, and it's not going to happen, Donald Trump is not going to bring back plants and coal mines and all the things that he promised. If we as a country don't face this, you're going to have continued churning among the electorate, and people are going to lose confidence in our democracies, confidence in capitalism. Next question, please. I guess that wasn't a question. I just gave that. We violated our own rule here.
Hi, my name's Akhil, and I'm a senior in high school. So my question is about the Democratic primary. You said, and I read some leaks earlier that said that top Clinton campaign officials thought Martin O'Malley would be a big threat at the outset. So to what extent do you think that the competitiveness of the primary was a result of Bernie Sanders, and to what extent was it just that any Democratic primary in 2016 was going to be competitive?
And was that Martin O'Malley who said that?
I was going to say, I don't remember who thought Martin O'Malley was going to be a big threat. I think, I don't recall that. I think that, you know, our view in the primaries was we expected to get a challenger from the left, which we did. And, you know, and obviously it emerged pretty early on, and it was it was a year-long campaign against Senator Sanders, but we were always anticipating that more than I think Governor O'Malley.
Do you think the decision to move away from the TPP was the right decision, given how strongly she had embraced it earlier?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there were some things at the end, which I said on TV over and over again, in the final deal that were less than ideal for America's interests. Some of which around the nations of origins provision, which is an arcane thing that would give China excess power.
I heard a lot of people in those communities in Michigan and Wisconsin talking about the origins of nations provision.
Well, you know, they may not be, but, you know, Hillary Clinton, you know, the details of policy matter. And she felt the one thing that bothered her, I think, the most had to do with how much power was given to China to actually control businesses in other countries in Asia, because you only had to own 45% of the company.
Do you believe that people believe that she switched her position on that because of the origins of
Can I tell you
nations
something?
provision?
I don't think TPP was a deciding factor in this election. We campaigned against a candidate. No, let me finish.
Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Sounds like one of our phone calls at 1 in the morning,
This is
right?
Larry can attest to that.
Look, we ran against the guy who was a full-throated critic of trade in the Democratic primary, right? And, you know, she made that change very early, right at the beginning of her announcement, and she defended that position. And if you look at the exit polls, by the way, as it happens, most Americans believe either that trade adds jobs or doesn't affect jobs. And what she said was a very bullish message on America, and I happen to believe it, that we have to trade with the rest of the world.
I hear you. My question is, her biggest liability was this sort of the honest and trustworthy thing that nagged at her, and did this actually exacerbate that problem, which was a bigger problem than trade?
No. I don't, you know, again, I'm not going to second guess a decision that was made a year ago in June.
All right, well, that's no fun. Let's get to the next question.
Well, you know.
My name is Panya, and I'm a senior in the college. So this election saw a greater focus on gender compared to Hillary Clinton's 2008 campaign in the primaries. However, a lot of women, especially white women, still voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit about why that may have happened, especially since the media particularly thought that very few women would vote for Donald Trump, given a lot of his more concerning remarks about women.
Yeah. You know, look, I don't think, you know, you'll correct me on the history, but, you know, I don't think people on a grand scale vote on presidential elections solely on identity. You know, Barack Obama, when he was running for president, Senator Obama then had a line that I think he said over and over again, that he wouldn't win the election because he was black, and he wouldn't lose the election because he was black. Again, there are things that are going to get baked into the race, you know, the election, that you're never going to shake loose. You know, if somebody didn't want to vote against President Obama because he was black, they weren't going to vote for him. If they wanted to because he was black, they would. Same thing when it comes to a woman. And I think that, you know, one of the things for us was that we won women by double digits overall. I think our numbers with men are probably not where we wanted them to be, particularly with older, you know, non-college educated men. But we were always expecting to perform less well there. But, you know, look, again, you've got this system here that, you know, you win the popular vote by a couple of points and you lose in a couple of the wrong states and you come up short. And that's what happened. I would think that, I think all the way through, there are always going to be some people who are going to vote for Hillary Clinton because they wanted the first woman president, and some people who would vote against her because they didn't want a woman for president. And maybe some people who just didn't want Hillary Clinton for president. I think ultimately people are voting on bigger things than that. I think that is probably a small piece of the puzzle that, as I say, is going to take a little bit longer than, you know, 2 weeks to unravel from my vantage point, because I'm going to spend more time poring over data in the next 6 weeks.
But the gender gap
to 2
wasn't
months.
what you expected.
It wasn't, you know, and it was, but more because of men. You know, voting more overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, particularly white men.
Yes.
Hello, my name's Ronan, and I'm a first year in the college. So throughout the course of this discussion, you've been making clear that you think that the reason that she lost was less in any weakness she had as a candidate and more in factors outside of her control, like the third parties and like the Comey announcement. However, there are still a lot of people who think that she wasn't actually, in this cycle, a very strong candidate. So what can Democrats do in the future to be stronger candidates, given the changing nature of the electorate?
Well, there are two things. Let me take the first part of your statement first, which wasn't part of the question. Look, every candidate comes to an election with strengths and weaknesses. There's never been a perfect candidate, not in my lifetime, not in any election I've ever seen would you say, this is a perfect candidate. You might have a candidate who you believe is right at that moment in time. They bring a set of things that people are looking for. In terms of the Democratic Party, I think one of the things that's clear here is that we need to rebuild our party at the state level. I think there are too many states where in the last, probably in this century, where we have been inattentive. States where we should be doing better. And I think that some of those states are states that we lost in this election, where we can't, give up the fight in those states because we lose a governorship or we lose the state legislature. I think we have to keep organizing, and I think we have to do it at the local level. That's how you build, I don't want to say a farm team, but that's how you build a real grassroots organization. You have to have committed, dedicated followers at the state level. Now, one of the challenges in our presidential campaigns now is they've become more national. They have become more national. Again, the changing media environment makes that possible. You look at Donald Trump, and Axe and I have long agreed with this. In a national campaign, the free media, the earned media, has a much bigger role to play than the television advertising. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising. But the earned media, as we call it, has a huge impact because it's 24-hour cable, it's 24-hour social media. Now, at the state level, you've got to do kind of the nuts and bolts of party building, and I think the Democratic Party has to do that better than we've done it. And I think, it is easy to get complacent when you have an incumbent president who has a fair degree of popularity, and that can hide some warts and flaws you have in the underlying structure because he was such a strong figure to his credit. And but underneath the surface here, we've got to do more to build the party now in a lot of these states that we have to compete in and do better in, not just in presidential elections, but year in and year out.
We're running over, but we have two more students in line, so we're going to take both those questions. So lock the door.
Hi, my name is Jacob, and I'm a second year in the college. You've obviously mentioned the media as a factor in this year's election, and I know one of the major critiques leveled against the media, especially from the left, was drawing a false equivalency between, say, Clinton's emails and Donald Trump's alleged assaults. Going forward, as the country remains incredibly polarized, how does the media remain unbiased and yet not draw false equivalencies necessarily where they shouldn't be drawn?
Look, that's going to be something I think that the major media outlets, television and print and social media, are going to have to deal with. I mean, I was at a conference, as I mentioned, in California, and people were there from Facebook and Twitter saying that they have to come to grips with fake news. And how are they going to deal with that? They right now do not curate and edit news the way newsrooms ostensibly do, and yet these things are explosive, and get hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people following it and propagating it as news. So I think this is not going to be an easy thing for the media. I think they've probably got, a year to figure it out before they go through, some serious elections. We're only going to have 2 big state elections coming up in 17 governor's races in New Jersey and Virginia. But I think there's going to have to be an evaluation inside those newsrooms and TV studios to figure out how they're going to handle it.
On the fake news question, Larry Grisolano has raised a really, I think, valuable and important point, which is we know that there was a lot of it out there. We don't know that it changed anybody's minds. We don't know who the recipients were and whether it just strengthened or those people who already believed, and or whether it was actually converting voters. And I don't know the answer, and you don't know the answer, but that's part of the project that has to be undertaken.
And I think you're right about that, and I think, this is one of the things when I say you've got to look at some things, and whether it changed anything or it just penetrated the ether in a way, right, and the environment in a way that polluted views of a candidate that was just building
I guess
up.
it's a question of who was breathing the ether, whether it was. So anyway.
Hi, my name is Ingo. I'm an LLM student at the law school. I was wondering, you said one of the predominant themes in this election again was the the theme of change and the deep dissatisfaction with the Washington establishment, which has obviously been similar in the last 2 elections. I was wondering if you see any chance that this will change over the next couple of years and that people will actually like Washington establishment and stability and continuation, so they will favor voting for something they know instead of the unknown.
What are the odds on that?
Look, there are some things that, look, we have not really modernized our democracy in a meaningful way in 240 years. I think we've got some things in Washington that impede progress. I think we have in the Senate a filibuster rule that, you know, at one point may have made sense. When the country was founded, the ratio of population from the largest state to the smallest was 7-to-1. Virginia was 7 times the size of Delaware. Today, it's 66-to-1. And in fact, the Electoral College, that ratio applied back in the founding of our country. Today, 660,000 people in California get 1 elector. In Wyoming, 195,000 people get 1 elector. I think the filibuster rule should go. That's my opinion. I think we ought to be able to have majority votes and things should be put on the floor, a set period of debate so the American people hear both sides, but they are entitled to a vote in Congress and their legislature. In the House of Representatives, there is a rule, folks in this room probably know who Denny Hastert was, I'm guessing. Well-named rule, the Hastert rule, which in the House, the majority, the Republicans have decided they will not put any bill on the floor in Congress if a majority of the Republican caucus doesn't support it. Well, you might have a majority in the House of Representatives who might vote for immigration reform with maybe 40 or 50 Republicans. Why wouldn't we put that bill on the floor if you represent a majority of people? So I think there are things that we need to look at. I think voter registration and voter suppression is a serious problem. We are the greatest democracy on earth. If American Express can give you a card with a chip in it and the federal government can send how many 18-year-olds here got a draft card on their birthday? Right? My son, when he was 18, it gets sent to you, right? If they know when you turn 18, you should get a voter card with a chip. States should be required to computerize the system. We shouldn't be voting on paper ballots and antiquated systems. We ought to modernize the democracy. And in this country, it ought to be easier to vote, not harder to vote.
On that stirring oratory, this is the theater major coming out here. I want to thank Joel Benenson for being here today for his years of service in many different ways, and we look forward to what you're going to do next.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking both Joel Benenson and David Axelrod. Special thanks also to our program team, our speaker series, communications team, and all of our students who help us put on these events all quarter. We thank you all so much. We wish you all the best, and we'll see you back here in January. Have a great evening.